"Don't talk," the homeless man said, covering the female cop's mouth, and by that one action, he saved her life. But what Jack saw that night in the rain was something so shocking, so dangerous, that speaking would have meant death for both of them. A shadowy figure, a limp bundle, a sedan waiting in the darkness. In that split second, this weathered man with nothing left to lose made a choice that changed everything. But here's what nobody expected. Jack wasn't just some random vagrant. He was a former mechanic with eyes that caught details others missed, a mind that remembered what mattered. And what he witnessed wasn't just a crime, it was the thread that would unravel a web of corruption reaching the highest levels of the city. Officer Sarah Nolan owed him her life, but when they started digging deeper, powerful people wanted them silenced. A respected developer with a charitable reputation, missing people, a conspiracy so deep it threatened to destroy anyone who dared expose it. Jack had already lost his family, his home, his place in the world. Now he faced a choice: stay invisible and safe or risk everything to save strangers he'd never met. Because sometimes the person society throws away is the only one brave enough to speak the truth. What happens when a homeless man becomes the city's last hope for justice? Can two unlikely allies take down an empire built on lies? And what price will they pay for refusing to stay silent? If you're ready to see how one whispered warning sparked a fight that shook an entire city, hit that subscribe button, because stories like this remind us that heroes come from the most unexpected places. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I love connecting with viewers around the world. The rain turned the streetlights into watercolor smears on the asphalt, yellow and orange bleeding into the darkness like spilled paint. Jack McCready walked Pickle along the familiar block, his worn boots splashing through puddles that reflected the neon signs of closed shops. The dog's ears were pinned back against the cold, but he stayed close, matching Jack's measured pace step for step. Jack counted the coins in his jacket pocket the way some men counted prayers, methodically, hopefully, knowing each one by touch. Quarters, dimes, a few nickels, and the strange brass token he'd found last week that wasn't worth anything to anyone but felt too important to throw away. Enough for coffee tomorrow if Marta was working. Maybe a day-old pastry for Pickle if she was feeling generous. That's when he noticed the sedan. Late model, dark blue, idling under the flickering streetlight like a predator waiting. The engine was running but the headlights were off, which was wrong in a way that made Jack's old instincts prickle. 30 years of fixing engines had taught him to notice things that didn't belong, sounds that weren't right. This wasn't right. A figure moved in the shadows beside the car, dressed in dark clothing, hands covered in work gloves. The person moved like smoke, deliberately, carefully, lifting something from behind a dumpster. Jack's breath caught in his throat. The bundle was small, limp, the wrong weight and shape to be anything but human. A child, maybe, or someone small enough to be carried like discarded cargo. The patrol car rounded the corner, just as the gloved figure reached the sedan's trunk. Officer Sarah Nolan stepped out of the cruiser, her breath visible in sharp puffs against the cold air. Jack had seen her before on this beat, professional, alert, the kind of cop who actually looked at people instead of through them. Her hand moved toward the radio clipped to her shoulder, ready to call in whatever she was seeing. Jack understood, with the clarity of someone who had learned survival in hard places, that her voice would change everything. The criminal would panic, run, fight, kill the officer, kill the victim. Maybe both. The math was simple and terrible. Without thought, Jack moved. His calloused hand clamped over Sarah's mouth from behind, gentle but firm, his other arm circling her waist to keep her still. "Don't talk," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the rain drumming on the pavement. He felt her body tense, ready to fight, then slowly relax as she followed his gaze toward the sedan. Pickle pressed himself between Jack's knees, sensing the danger in the way animals always could. Across the street, through the curtain of rain and reflected light, Jack locked eyes with the criminal. For a moment that stretched like a held breath, the two men stared at each other. Jack's silence became a negotiation, a wordless understanding. "I see you, but I'm not a threat. take what you came for, and go." The gloved figure finished loading the bundle into the trunk, slammed it shut, and slipped into the driver's seat. The sedan pulled away slowly, taillights disappearing around the corner like dying embers. Jack released Sarah, stepping back into the shadows. The immediate danger had passed, but he could feel her trembling, could hear the sharp intake of breath as reality settled over her like cold water. She owed him her life now, though she probably didn't understand the cost of that debt yet. Her hand moved toward her radio anyway, muscle memory stronger than shock. Jack was already fading back into the rain, becoming invisible again the way men like him had learned to do. But he knew this wasn't over. It never was. Once you'd seen something you weren't supposed to see. Officer Sarah Nolan sat at her desk in the precinct, staring at the incident report she'd typed and retyped 3 times. Each version felt more inadequate than the last. How do you explain a moment when silence saved your life? How do you describe a homeless man who appeared from nowhere, made you complicit in letting a crime unfold, then vanished like smoke? The cursor blinked on the screen, waiting for words that wouldn't come. She'd written about the sedan, late model, dark blue, partial license plate obscured by mud. She'd described the figure in work gloves, the suspicious bundle, the way the vehicle had departed when she'd been prevented from radioing for backup. But there was a hole in the story where Jack should have been, a gap she couldn't seem to fill without making herself sound either incompetent or crazy. Sergeant Bender glanced over her shoulder, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. No leads on the vehicle? His tone suggested he preferred it that way. Clean cases closed quickly. Messy cases attracted attention from downtown. Questions about resource allocation and clearance rates. "Nothing concrete," Sarah replied, which was technically true. The sedan had vanished into the maze of city streets like it had never existed at all. Captain Morrison logged the incident as possible transient interference and moved on to budget reports. Sarah watched him reduce the night's events to a single line of text, filing it away where it would gather digital dust until the next quarterly review. The system had a way of making inconvenient truths disappear, but Sarah couldn't shake the stranger's eyes. Gray-blue, weathered at the corners, but sharp with an intelligence that cut through the rain and darkness. Those weren't the eyes of someone who acted without thinking. They belonged to a man who had calculated the odds in seconds and chosen the harder path, letting a crime happen to prevent a greater tragedy. She drove back to the block where it had happened, parking under the same flickering streetlight. The rain had stopped, but the pavement still held pools of reflected neon. She walked the area methodically, her flashlight beam sweeping across wet concrete and scattered debris. Near the dumpster where the homeless man had knelt, something caught the light. A coin, half buried in the grime between 2 cracked sidewalk sections. But not a regular coin. This was brass, tarnished with age, with markings she didn't recognize. Sarah pried it loose with her fingernail and held it up to the streetlight. It felt warm in her palm, substantial, like it meant something to someone. Marta's coffee house was still open, its windows glowing amber against the darkness. Sarah pushed through the door, breathing in the smell of roasted beans and day-old pastries. The barista behind the counter was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of work beyond serving coffee. "I'm looking for someone," Sarah said, showing her badge. "A homeless man, older, travels with a dog. He might come in here regularly." Marta's expression didn't change, but her movements slowed as she wiped down the espresso machine. "Jack," she said finally, "comes by every morning around 7. Orders black coffee, no sugar. Sometimes leaves small repairs if anyone needs them, loose cabinet hinges, squeaky door handles. Never asks for payment, just takes whatever people can spare." "He fixed things for you?" "Fixed the lock on my back door last month. Wouldn't take money, but I gave him coffee and a sandwich for his dog." Marta paused, studying Sarah's face. "He's a good man. Whatever you think he did, you're probably wrong." Sarah drove back to her apartment, but sleep wouldn't come. She found herself at her window overlooking the street, watching the late-night rhythm of the city, delivery trucks, shift workers heading home, the occasional patrol car making its rounds. And there, across the street, under the awning of a closed electronics store, she saw him. Jack sat with his back against the brick wall, Pickle curled against his side. Even from 3 floors up, Sarah could see the careful way he portioned out kibble for the dog before taking a bite of his own food. The ritual spoke of discipline, of someone who understood priority and sacrifice in ways that couldn't be taught. She made her choice then, watching him fold a worn photograph back into his wallet before settling in for the night. Tomorrow she would find him. Tomorrow she would get answers. Because whatever had happened in that rain-soaked alley, it was far from over. Sarah found Jack the next morning outside Marta's coffee house, sitting on a milk crate with Pickle at his feet. He was working on something small and mechanical, his weathered fingers moving with the precision of someone who understood how broken things could be made whole again. When he looked up and saw her uniform, his hand stilled, but he didn't run. "Officer," he said, his voice neutral. The word carried weight, acknowledgement without submission, respect without fear. Sarah sat down on the concrete steps beside him, close enough to talk but far enough to let him choose flight if he needed it. "I never thanked you," she said, "for last night." Jack's eyes flicked toward her, then back to his work. He was repairing a small transistor radio, using tools from a battered tin box that looked like it had survived decades of hard use. "Nothing to thank me for. Just kept things quiet when quiet was needed. You saved my life." The words felt strange in her mouth, too big for the simple exchange they'd shared in the rain. "Maybe." Jack's fingers found a loose wire, guided it back into place. "Or maybe I just stopped you from making noise at the wrong time. World's full of wrong times." Sarah pulled the brass coin from her pocket and held it out to him. "You drop this." Jack glanced at the token, and for the first time, something shifted in his expression, not surprise exactly, but recognition. "Keep it," he said. "Found it myself. Figured it might mean something to somebody someday." "The man with the gloves," Sarah said, keeping her voice low. "You got a good look at him." Jack set down his tools, considering her words like a chess player studying the board. Finally, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small notebook, its pages yellowed and soft from handling. "Construction gloves," he said, sketching with a pencil stub. "Logo on the back, 3 arrows pointing inward, forming a triangle. Work gloves, not the cheap kind. The kind union guys wear on big jobs." Sarah leaned closer to study the sketch. Jack's drawing was precise, detailed, the work of someone who noticed things and remembered them. "You're sure about the logo?" 28 years fixing machinery for construction crews. I know work gear." Jack flipped to another page, wrote down a sequence of letters and numbers. "Partial plate. Couldn't see it all through the rain, but what I saw, I remember." Sarah pulled out her phone and ran the partial plate through the database. Nothing immediate came back, but that didn't surprise her. Professional criminals knew how to make vehicles disappear into paperwork mazes and shell companies. "There's a construction site 2 blocks from where we saw the sedan," she said. "Big development project, crews working nights." "Hargrove Commons," Jack said without hesitation. "Been watching them work for months. Good scaffold work, expensive equipment. But they run teams at odd hours, and some of the night crew doesn't look like construction workers." They walked to the site together, an unlikely pair, the uniformed officer and the homeless man with his loyal dog. Jack moved through the maze of scaffolding and equipment trailers like he belonged there, pointing out details that Sarah would have missed, the way certain trucks were parked to block sight lines, the fact that some of the night workers didn't carry standard tools, the luxury trailer with tinted windows where men in suits came and went without hard hats. "There," Jack said, pointing to a courier van pulling up to a loading dock. "Same model as the sedan, different color. Watch the driver." They positioned themselves behind a concrete barrier, Sarah using her binoculars, while Jack relied on eyes that had been trained by necessity to see what others missed. The courier emerged carrying a duffel bag, moving with the same careful deliberation they'd witnessed the night before. Sarah keyed her radio to call for backup, but Jack's hand touched her wrist. "Wait," he whispered. "Let him make the drop first. Evidence is better than suspicion." They watched the exchange, duffel bag for envelope, quick and professional. But as the courier turned to leave, he stumbled on an uneven piece of pavement. The bag fell open for just a moment, spilling its contents across the asphalt. The courier scrambled to collect everything, but in his haste, he missed something small glinting in the morning light. "Now," Jack said, and Sarah radioed for backup while he moved forward to retrieve what had been left behind. It was a tiny silver locket, no bigger than a quarter, with the initials LM engraved on its surface. Sarah had seen that locket before, on a missing person poster that had haunted the station bulletin board for 3 months. A 12-year-old girl named Lily Martinez vanished without a trace on her way home from school. Jack held the locket in his palm, and Sarah saw something change in his weathered face. This wasn't just about a crime witnessed in the rain anymore. This was about a child who needed to be found. The evidence room at the precinct felt different when Sarah logged Lily's locket into the system. What had been a cold case file suddenly hummed with possibility. The tiny silver charm transforming months of dead ends into a thread that might lead somewhere. Detective Rodriguez, who had worked Lily's disappearance since the beginning, held the locket up to the fluorescent light with something approaching reverence. "Where did you find this?" Rodriguez asked, his voice tight with the kind of hope that scared experienced cops. "Construction site. Hargrove Commons Development." Sarah kept her explanation simple, professional. She didn't mention Jack by name, referring to him only as a witness who provided assistance. The system had ways of making inconvenient people disappear, and Jack had already faded from too many official records. Rodriguez was already pulling files, cross-referencing the construction company's permits and contractor lists. For 2 hours, the momentum built like a wave gathering strength. Phone calls were made, databases were searched. A pattern began to emerge, connecting the development project to a series of missing person cases that stretched back 18 months. Then Raymond Hargrove held his press conference. Sarah watched it on the break room television, feeling her stomach drop with each carefully crafted word. Hargrove stood behind a podium flanked by city officials and community leaders, announcing a new charitable housing initiative that would provide homes for displaced families. The cameras loved him, silver-haired, well-dressed, speaking with the kind of moral authority that came from writing large checks to worthy causes. "This development represents more than just buildings," Hargrove said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "It represents hope. It represents second chances for those who need them most." The applause was thunderous. The reporters were charmed. The mayor shook Hargrove's hand with the enthusiasm of someone whose campaign fund had been generously supported. Within an hour, Hargrove's lawyer was in Captain Morrison's office. Sarah couldn't hear the conversation through the closed door, but she watched her captain's body language change from attentive to defensive to quietly resigned. When Morrison emerged, his face carried the kind of careful neutrality that meant someone important had made a phone call. "The Martinez evidence needs additional verification," Morrison announced to the squad room. "We're not moving forward until we can establish a clear chain of custody and eliminate any possibility of contamination." Sergeant Bender delivered the more personal message later, pulling Sarah aside near the coffee machine. "You're walking a thin line, Nolan. Following up on tips is one thing. Going rogue with unverified sources is another. The brass is watching this case closely, and they don't want any department black eyes over false leads." The warning might have been enough to slow Sarah down, but the smear campaign started that evening. Someone had dug deep into Jack's past, and the local news couldn't resist the story. Former mechanic turned vagrant, multiple arrests for vagrancy and public intoxication, a man whose own family had cut ties with him years ago, who'd lost everything to drink and bad decisions. The narrative wrote itself. Desperate homeless man fabricates evidence to get attention from police. The construction site incident was reframed as trespassing. The missing locket became unverified material of unknown origin. Social media picked up the story, and within hours, Jack's photo was circulating with hashtags about the dangers of trusting unreliable witnesses. The coup de grace came the next morning. An accident at the construction site, a scaffolding collapse that injured a worker and damaged expensive equipment. The company's insurance investigator found evidence of tampering, bolt cutters left nearby, safety cables deliberately severed. The conclusion was obvious to anyone who wanted to see it. The homeless man who'd been spotted around the site had set a trap. Sarah arrived at the precinct to find Jack in handcuffs, sitting in interview room 2 with a public defender who looked barely old enough to vote. Pickle was nowhere to be seen, and when Sarah asked, she learned the dog had been taken to animal control pending resolution of the case. Through the one-way glass, she watched Jack sit perfectly still, his hands folded on the metal table. He didn't fidget or protest or demand phone calls. He just waited with the patience of someone who had learned that the world's machinery ground slowly and rarely in his favor. Captain Morrison found her there an hour later. "Your report on the Martinez evidence has been pulled for review," he said without preamble. "You have a choice to make, Nolan. You can be a team player and let this thing die quietly, or you can keep pushing and find out what happens to officers who prioritize personal crusades over department solidarity." Sarah stared through the glass at Jack, remembering the way he'd counted coins like prayers, the precise sketch of the construction logo, the moment when he'd held Lily's locket and something had shifted in his weathered face. The machinery of power was already working to erase him, to turn his truth into inconvenience. But some truths, once seen, refused to stay buried. The holding cell smelled like disinfectant and defeat. Jack sat on the narrow bench, his back against the concrete wall, watching dust motes dance in the shaft of light that slanted through the single barred window. 48 hours now since they'd brought him in, 48 hours of questions he answered with careful honesty that no one wanted to hear. The memories came anyway, the way they always did in confined spaces. The factory closure notice posted on a Friday afternoon in December, pink slips handed out like party favors after 23 years of showing up on time. The medical bills that started small and grew into monsters that devoured savings and credit scores, and finally the house on Maple Street with its yellow kitchen and creaky back door. The funeral he'd missed because the car had been repossessed, and he'd spent the insurance money on Sarah's cancer treatments instead of the plane ticket home. His daughter's last letter was still in his wallet, 4 years old now and soft from folding. She'd written it from her new apartment in Portland, explaining why she couldn't help anymore, why she needed space to build her own life away from the wreckage of his. He understood. Sometimes love meant knowing when to let go. A commotion in the corridor broke through his thoughts. Voices he recognized, Marta from the coffee shop, Mrs. Chen who owned the laundromat, even old Pete who collected cans near the bus station. They were arguing with the desk sergeant, their words tumbling over each other in a cascade of righteous indignation. "He fixed my door when no one else would," Marta was saying, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never backed down from a fight that mattered. "Never asked for a dime. Just took the coffee I offered and thanked me like I'd given him gold." Mrs. Chen chimed in with stories of Jack repairing washing machines and replacing broken tiles, always working carefully, never leaving a mess. Pete described the way Jack would share food with whoever needed it most, even when he barely had enough for himself. The desk sergeant kept explaining procedure, but the small crowd wasn't interested in procedure. They had receipts, literal receipts from coffee purchases, thank you notes, photographs of repairs that Jack had completed. They had evidence of a man who made the neighborhood a little better simply by being in it. Sarah appeared in the doorway an hour later, out of uniform, carrying 2 cups of coffee and something that might have been hope. She sat across from him on the visitor's side of the table, sliding 1 cup through the slot in the partition. "They won't let me back on the case," she said without preamble. "Official reprimand in my file, pending review. Could lose my badge if I keep pushing." Jack sipped the coffee, black, no sugar, the way Marta made it. "So don't push." "Can't do that." Sarah leaned forward, lowering her voice. "While they were busy building a case against you, I did some digging of my own. That construction company you identified? It's a subsidiary of a subsidiary, but the paper trail leads back to Hargrove's empire. And that wood stamping you noticed on the scaffolding? Same 3-arrow logo. She pulled out a manila folder, spreading photographs across the small table. "This is from the city records office. Every permit, every inspection, every safety violation that's been quietly overlooked. Hargrove's been running this operation for 2 years, using construction sites as fronts for something much darker." Jack studied the documents, his mechanic's eye-catching details that might have escaped others. Shell companies layered like Russian dolls, inspection dates that coincided with missing person reports, a pattern of permits that created temporary spaces where people could disappear without leaving official traces. "The DA won't touch it," Sarah continued. "Too much political heat. Hargrove's lawyers are already filing motions to suppress evidence, claiming illegal surveillance and harassment. They're calling you a dangerous vagrant who's manipulated a naive officer into pursuing a vendetta." Through the small window, Jack could see the sun setting behind the courthouse, painting the sky in shades of amber and rust. Somewhere in the city, Pickle was waiting in a concrete kennel, trusting that Jack would come back the way he always had. Somewhere else, a 12-year-old girl named Lily was waiting too, hoping someone would care enough to keep looking. Jack reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out something he'd kept hidden during the booking process. A small, folded photograph, torn at one corner and faded with age. He smoothed it out on the table between them, a young girl with dark hair and bright eyes, wearing a silver locket that caught the camera's flash. "This is Emma," he said quietly. "My granddaughter. She'd be about Lily's age now if—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat. "I couldn't save her when it mattered, but maybe I can save someone else's girl." Sarah stared at the photograph, understanding flooding her eyes. This wasn't about redemption or justice or proving a point anymore. This was about a grandfather's love that had outlasted failure and loss and 4 years of living on the streets. This was about making sure that somewhere, somehow, a little girl got to come home. Jack's bail hearing was standing room only. Marta had organized the coffee shop regulars, Mrs. Chen brought half the laundromat's customers, and even Pete showed up in a clean shirt he'd borrowed from someone. The public defender looked stunned when the judge set bail at $500 and 12 different people stepped forward with crumpled bills and loose change. They pooled their resources the way neighborhoods used to, back when people knew each other's names and troubles. Within an hour, Jack walked out of the courthouse with Pickle pressed against his legs, the dog's tail beating against his worn jeans like a drumstick against hope. Sarah was waiting by her car, engine running. She'd traded her uniform for civilian clothes, jeans, sneakers, a jacket that had seen better years. "We don't have much time," she said as Jack climbed into the passenger seat. "Hargrove's lawyers are filing for an injunction tomorrow. If they succeed, all our evidence gets sealed, pending their civil suit." They drove to a diner on the edge of town where the coffee was strong and the booths offered privacy. Sarah spread out a city map marked with red pins, construction sites, missing person locations, transportation routes that formed a pattern when viewed from above. Jack studied the connections with the same methodical attention he'd once given to engine schematics. "He's smart," Jack said, tracing routes with his finger. "Uses the construction permits to create temporary spaces, places where trucks can come and go without attracting attention. But he needs storage. Somewhere to hold people between pickup and transport." Sarah had already thought of that. Industrial district, east of the river. Lots of warehouses, minimal security, perfect for short-term operations. She paused, meeting Jack's eyes across the table. "This is it, Jack. We go in tonight, or we lose our chance forever." They recruited carefully. Marta closed the coffee shop early and brought her nephew Carlos, who worked security and knew how to move quietly in dark places. Detective Rodriguez agreed to help off the books, his conscience finally outweighing his concern for procedure. Mrs. Chen surprised everyone by offering to monitor police scanners from her car. She'd learned the skill during her younger days as a community activist. The warehouse district at midnight felt like the edge of the world. Streetlights were sporadic, casting pools of yellow that made the darkness between buildings seem absolute. Jack led them through the maze of loading docks and storage facilities, his homeless man's knowledge of hidden spaces and overlooked corners proving invaluable. They found Hargrove's operation in a building that had been abandoned for months, according to city records, but showed signs of recent activity: fresh tire tracks in the gravel, security cameras that were too new for a vacant property, the faint hum of generators running somewhere inside. Jack studied the layout with a technician's eye, noting weak points in the fencing, blind spots in the camera coverage, the way the loading dock doors had been reinforced from the inside. 3 ways in, he whispered to Sarah, but only 1 way out if things go bad. They split up. Sarah and Rodriguez positioned themselves near the main entrance with camera equipment and radio contact. Marta and Carlos covered the rear exit. Jack went alone through a ventilation system he'd spotted along the building's north wall, a route that required the kind of flexibility that came from years of squeezing into impossible spaces. Inside, the warehouse was divided into temporary rooms constructed from shipping containers and plywood walls. Jack moved through the maze like smoke, documenting what he saw with the small camera Sarah had given him. Transportation schedules chalked on walls, ledgers that recorded human beings as cargo, and in the furthest corner, behind a door that required 2 different keys, he found them. Lily Martinez huddled in a corner with 3 other children, their faces pale in the flashlight beam, but their eyes still holding the spark of hope that someone, somewhere, was looking for them. Jack knelt beside Lily, showing her the silver locket they'd found. "Your mama's been looking for you," he whispered. "We're going to take you home." The sound of approaching footsteps made him freeze. Heavy boots, multiple sets, moving with purpose through the warehouse corridors. Jack keyed his radio to Sarah, speaking in the shorthand they'd developed. "Package located. Company coming. Need that exit now." But as he helped the children toward the ventilation shaft, a steel door slammed shut behind them. Emergency lights flooded the space with harsh red illumination, and Raymond Hargrove's voice echoed through hidden speakers, calm and controlled and absolutely certain of his power. "Mr. McCready," Hargrove said, his words carrying the weight of money and influence and connections that reached into every corner of the city's power structure. "I think it's time we had a conversation about the cost of interfering with legitimate business operations." Jack positioned himself between Hargrove's approaching security team and the 4 children who had already suffered too much. His ribs ached from the beating he'd taken during his arrest, his hands shook from too little food and too much stress, but his voice was steady when he spoke into the radio. "Sarah," he said, "light it up." The warehouse erupted in chaos as Sarah's signal brought federal agents pouring through every entrance. The FBI had been tracking Hargrove's operation for months, waiting for evidence substantial enough to break through his legal protections. Jack's photographs and the rescued children provided exactly what they needed, proof that couldn't be explained away by expensive lawyers or political connections. Hargrove tried to run, but the maze of shipping containers that had hidden his crimes now trapped him like a rat in a maze. When they found him, he was still clutching his cell phone, frantically calling contacts who suddenly refused to take his calls. Money could buy silence, but it couldn't purchase loyalty once the FBI started offering immunity deals. The investigation that followed unraveled 2 years of systematic trafficking, corruption that reached into City Hall, and a network of complicit officials who had looked the other way in exchange for campaign contributions and construction contracts. The ledgers Jack had photographed became the prosecution's roadmap, each entry corresponding to a missing person report that had been filed and forgotten. Lily Martinez was reunited with her mother on a Tuesday morning that felt like resurrection. The local news cameras captured the moment, a 12-year-old girl running into arms that had never stopped reaching for her, tears that washed away months of nightmares and sleepless nights. But for Jack, watching from the back of the crowd, the real miracle was smaller and quieter. The way Lily's hand went immediately to her throat, checking for the silver locket that would always remind her someone had cared enough to keep looking. The city hearing took place 3 weeks later in the municipal building's largest conference room, every seat filled with reporters, survivors, and citizens who had learned that their voices mattered when they spoke together. Sarah testified first, her words precise and unwavering as she described the investigation that had been discouraged at every turn by officials more concerned with political convenience than public safety. Then it was Jack's turn. He walked to the witness table with Pickle at his side. The city had made a special exception for service animals, and nobody had bothered to ask what service Pickle provided beyond loyalty. Jack wore the same worn jacket he'd owned for years, but Marta had pressed his shirt and Mrs. Chen had trimmed his hair, and his voice carried clearly through the room's silence. He spoke about dignity, how it lived in small acts of kindness between neighbors, how it survived even when everything else had been stripped away. He described what justice looked like when people were treated as people rather than problems to be managed or forgotten. He didn't ask for apologies or compensation or recognition. He simply told the truth about what he had seen and why it mattered that someone had finally listened. Hargrove's empire collapsed like a building with rotten foundations. The construction company was dissolved, its assets seized to compensate victims and their families. Several city officials resigned in disgrace. Others faced criminal charges that would follow them long after the news cameras moved on to other stories. But the change that mattered most to Jack was smaller than headlines or convictions. Marta and Sarah had partnered with a local nonprofit to establish a community workshop where people could learn trades, repair things that were broken, and remember that everyone had skills worth sharing. They offered Jack the position of workshop supervisor with a small apartment above the tool room and enough salary to buy kibble for Pickle and coffee for himself. On the morning he moved in, Jack stood at the threshold holding the brass key they'd given him, not symbolic this time, but real and solid and warm in his palm. Pickle sat beside him, tail wagging with the patience of someone who had always known that eventually every door that mattered would open. The neighborhood children had already discovered the workshop, bringing broken bicycles and skateboards and toys that needed fixing. Their laughter echoed through the space where Jack arranged his tools with the care of someone who understood that every repair was a small act of hope, every fixed thing proof that broken didn't have to mean worthless. He turned the key and stepped inside, Pickle trotting beside him. For the first time in years, Jack McCready was home.